In simple terms, a Navy-centered show like this is useful to North Korea even before the ship proves itself in real operational terms. The image does work before the vessel does. That may be the most important thing to understand here. The Choi Hyun does not have to be a perfect or battle-tested platform to serve a political purpose. It just has to appear usable, repeatable, and connected to North Korea's deterrent story. A first test can look ceremonial. A second test suggests follow-through. The timing adds another layer. These launches came as the United States and South Korea began Freedom Shield 26, their annual joint military exercise. Washington and Seoul described the drill as defensive and focused on strengthening alliance response capabilities. North Korea, however, routinely describes such exercises as rehearsals for invasion and often answers them with weapons demonstrations of its own. In that context, the destroyer tests fit a familiar cycle. Allied drills on one side, North Korean signaling on the other. But there's also something new here. The response is not centered only on land-based missiles. Pyongyang is showcasing a ship. That suggests Kim wants foreign governments to think not just about North Korea's ability to launch from fixed or mobile sites on land, but about its ambition to complicate the maritime map as well. North Korea has been especially vocal about naval power recently. Reporting from earlier this month said Kim inspected the Choi Hyun for 2 straight days, called for building 2 warships a year over the next 5 years of the same or higher class, and linked naval development to what he described as progress in arming the Navy with nuclear weapons. State media also said a 3rd destroyer of the same class could be completed by October. Even if outside experts remain skeptical about how quickly North Korea can turn these claims into reliable capability, the direction of travel is clear. Pyongyang wants to be seen as building a more prominent sea-based deterrent. And that is where this story becomes more than a clip of missiles in the sky. Because military signaling is never just about hardware. It is also about audience. And in this case, there are at least 4 audiences. The first audience is Washington. The message there is that pressure, sanctions, and military drills have not frozen North Korea's weapons development. If anything, Pyongyang wants to show that its program is broadening into new domains. The second audience is Seoul. South Korea's military and political leadership already track North Korea's missile force closely. But a more visible naval component creates fresh planning problems. Maritime warning time, coastal defense assumptions, and the politics of deterrence all become more complicated when North Korea tries to project strike options from the sea. The third audience is domestic. North Korea is a system where political theater matters, and Kim's appearances are designed as internal proof of leadership, direction, and technological momentum. The image of Kim calmly watching a remote launch from a conference room reinforces the idea of command and control. The leader sees everything, approves everything, and remains at the center of military progress. The fourth audience, maybe the most interesting, succession watchers. Kim's daughter appeared with him again during this event, even though the official text dispatch did not highlight her directly. That detail matters because she has now appeared repeatedly at major military events. No outside observer can confirm the internal succession timetable with certainty, but the pattern of public appearances is real. When she shows up at high-stakes military spectacles, the regime is at minimum allowing the association to deepen. In other words, the missile test had 2 visual protagonists, the warship and the family line. That combination is not accidental. It lets North Korea project continuity on 2 fronts at once. The weapons continue. The dynasty continues. Now, there's a temptation in coverage like this to race toward worst-case predictions. That is where a lot of geopolitical content loses credibility. So let's slow down and separate what this event does prove from what it does not prove. It does prove that North Korea is continuing weapons demonstrations despite diplomatic isolation and sanctions pressure. It does prove that Pyongyang wants the Choi Hyun associated with strategic strike capability. It does prove that Kim is spending unusual attention on naval modernization at a time when his military agenda has been heavily focused on survivable nuclear delivery systems. It does prove that North Korea is using the Allied exercise window to reinforce its standard argument that U.S.-South Korea drills will be met with military responses. What it does not prove is that the Choi Hyun is already a fully mature combat platform equal to major regional naval forces. Outside analysts and South Korean officials have openly questioned whether the ship is ready for active service. It also does not prove that a naval conflict is imminent, and it does not prove that every claim in North Korean state media should be taken at face value. The images and dispatches come from a system built for messaging as much as transparency. Because one of the biggest strategic questions in Asia has always been whether pressure on hostile states can force long-term political change, or whether it mostly deepens their belief that they must become more dangerous to remain safe. North Korea's latest move strongly hints that Pyongyang believes the answer is the second one. In other words, North Korea may be reading this conflict not as a regional exception, but as a universal lesson. The lesson, in its eyes, may be that if a state is marked for coercion, then the safest path is to raise the cost of coercing it, And once you understand that, Kim Jong-un's real message to America becomes easier to interpret. It is not just, we support Iran. It is, we are watching what happens to states under attack, and we believe it proves our model right. Now, to be careful and fair, there is a difference between what North Korea is signaling and what North Korea can actually do. A public endorsement does not automatically mean some dramatic change in material policy. It does not mean a new alliance treaty was just formed. It does not mean Pyongyang is about to intervene directly in the conflict. None of that should be exaggerated. But signaling still matters, especially from a state like North Korea, where public language is often tightly controlled and strategically chosen. And the signal here seems to have at least 4 layers. First, there's the political layer. By publicly recognizing and respecting Iran's leadership succession, North Korea is lending rhetorical legitimacy to the continuity of the Iranian state under war conditions. It is effectively saying that outside attack does not give outsiders the right to define what comes next inside Iran. Second, there is the ideological layer. Pyongyang is again casting the US and Israel as aggressors violating sovereignty. This fits North Korea's long-standing propaganda frame. But in moments like this, propaganda also doubles as deterrence messaging. It says, we see intervention not as rules-based enforcement, but as power politics dressed up in legal language. Third, there's the military layer. Kim's simultaneous emphasis on strategic cruise missiles and a more powerful deterrent reminds outside audiences that North Korea wants to be seen as armed, ready, and increasingly sophisticated. Even when the immediate news story is Iran, Pyongyang manages to bring the conversation back to its own arsenal. Fourth, there is the negotiation layer. This is where the message becomes more nuanced. Reports in recent months have suggested that the Trump administration had shown some willingness to revive higher-level talks with North Korea, while Kim had also indicated that relations could improve if Washington accepted North Korea's status as a nuclear power. That means Pyongyang's message is not necessarily no talks ever. It may instead be, talks happen only on terms that reflect power realities, not fantasies about forced disarmament. That last point is crucial. A lot of commentary around North Korea swings between 2 extremes. Either Pyongyang only wants confrontation, or Pyongyang is always secretly desperate for a deal. Reality is usually more complicated. North Korea often wants both leverage and optionality. It wants strength on the table and diplomacy available when useful. It wants to be feared enough to be negotiated with seriously. And it wants any eventual talks to begin from recognition, not humiliation. Seen through that lens, backing Iran's new leader is not just anti-American theater. It may also be part of Pyongyang's ongoing effort to shape the terms on which America thinks about hostile nuclear-armed states. North Korea's implied argument seems to be this: if Washington wants to avoid wider instability, it should learn the correct lesson from Iran. And in Pyongyang's mind, the correct lesson is not that adversarial regimes can be easily broken. It is that trying to break them can intensify their survival instincts, tighten their internal control, and convince every other targeted state that stronger deterrence is the only rational response. That is a message about credibility. And credibility is where this gets uncomfortable for the United States, because North Korea has spent years trying to convince the world that it cannot be handled the same way as weaker or less heavily armed states. Every time another U.S. adversary comes under military pressure, Pyongyang gets another opportunity to repeat the same line in a new form. This is exactly why we built what we built. That does not make North Korea morally right. It does make its strategic communication consistent. And consistency matters in geopolitical messaging, because it helps states look less reactive and more doctrinal. North Korea wants to appear doctrinal. It wants to look like a regime that predicted this pattern all along. That is why its statements often feel repetitive. Repetition is the point. It is how Pyongyang turns every crisis into evidence for its existing worldview. So if you ask what Kim Jong-un's real message to America is, the safest and strongest answer is not an overblown one. It is this: Pyongyang appears to be telling Washington that wars aimed at reshaping hostile regimes do not scare North Korea into compliance. They reinforce North Korea's conviction that strategic weapons and hard deterrence are essential to regime survival. That is the core of the message. And if that reading is right, then the implications go beyond rhetoric. For one thing, this kind of messaging can make future diplomacy harder. If North Korea believes the Iran war strengthens its argument for keeping and expanding strategic capabilities, then persuading Pyongyang to trade those capabilities away becomes even more difficult. The political selling point inside North Korea would be obvious. Why would we surrender the very tools we believe keep us from suffering the same fate as others? For another, this message is not aimed only at America. It is also aimed at China, Russia, South Korea, Japan, and the broader international audience that watches how states survive crises. Pyongyang wants all of them to understand that North Korea sees itself not as an isolated exception, but as part of a wider global contest over sovereignty, intervention, and deterrence. That broader audience matters because North Korea is always trying to turn bilateral pressure into a multilateral argument. It prefers not to look like a singular problem. It prefers to look like part of a pattern. Once it becomes part of a pattern, its actions can be framed as defensive, predictable, even inevitable inside its own narrative. And again, that brings us back to the endorsement itself. By respecting Iran's selection of a new supreme leader, North Korea is doing more than acknowledging a leadership change. It is saying the Iranian system continues. It is saying outside military force did not earn the right to politically redesign Iran, and it is saying states under pressure still claim the authority to define their own continuity. That theme of continuity is very important for Pyongyang because North Korea's own political identity is built around regime continuity under siege. In its own telling, the state survives because it does not bend. So when it looks at Iran's transition under fire, what it notices first is not moderation or reform. It notices endurance, and endurance is the value Pyongyang respects most. Now, some viewers may ask, does this mean North Korea is preparing something bigger? The honest answer is that public reporting here supports caution, not hype. The verified facts show a political endorsement, condemnation of the attacks, and a military display involving cruise missiles from a new destroyer. Those are meaningful signals, but they are not proof by themselves of some immediate new military axis or a dramatic shift beyond what has already been visible in North Korea's broader posture. That distinction matters, especially if the goal is serious analysis rather than sensationalism. Still, even without exaggeration, this is a significant moment. It shows North Korea moving quickly to define the meaning of events in a way that benefits its own strategic narrative. It shows Kim Jong-un pairing foreign policy commentary with visible military messaging. And it shows that Pyongyang thinks the war around Iran is not just a Middle East story. It is also a propaganda, deterrence, and negotiation story for Northeast Asia. That is why Washington should not dismiss this as routine noise. Because routine noise from North Korea often becomes the background music of bigger policy failures. Pyongyang spends years saying the same things, building the same systems, and reinforcing the same logic. Then, over time, those things stop being rhetoric and start becoming the accepted parameters of reality. North Korea's arsenal grows, its bargaining position hardens, and the space for easy solutions gets smaller. So the real importance of this endorsement may not lie in what changes tomorrow morning. It may lie in what it tells us about how North Korea interprets pressure, how it intends to justify its own buildup, and how it wants America to understand the consequences of regime-targeted war. If you strip away the headlines and boil it down to one sentence, the signal looks something like this. Pyongyang believes the Iran war is proving that security belongs to states that can deter, endure, and survive the first blow. That is a message America will not like, but it is probably the message North Korea wanted heard. And that is exactly why this story matters. Not because North Korea's endorsement magically changes the battlefield overnight, not because one statement rewrites the balance of power, but because it reveals, in unusually clear form, the political lesson Kim Jong-un appears to be drawing from the war. That vulnerability invites pressure. Pressure justifies deterrence, and deterrence remains the regime's strongest claim to survival. For the United States, that is the strategic warning hidden inside the headline. For Iran, it is a vote of public support. For North Korea, it is a chance to validate its doctrine. And for everyone watching, it is a reminder that in moments of war, even short diplomatic statements can carry a much larger message than the words alone suggest.